Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this timely conversation about policing, personhood, and racial politics in the urban environment. My name is Rorty. I'm a fourth year in the college studying economics and environmental and urban studies, and it is my honor to introduce this year's Frizzell Series event, featuring UCLA's Professor Ananya Roy, a world-class expert on urban planning and social welfare. Tonight's event will be moderated by UChicago's own Professor Kathleen Cavanaugh, whose groundbreaking socio-legal research on human rights, democracy, violence, and more is a fascinating complement to Roy's work. As many of you know, the Frizzell Lecture Series is an annual event held in honor of Alexandra Alex Frizzell, who passed away tragically as a college fourth year in 2013. Alex was an honors economics student, passionate about environmental economics, human rights, and health. And today, the Frizzell Family Speaker and Learning Series is a years-long student-organized series of events that engages the topics about which Alex was most passionate. I know I speak for students across the college when I thank the Frizzell family for continuing to foster essential conversations at UChicago in Alex's memory. I also want to thank programmatic sponsors of the Frizzell series. First, tonight's event is sponsored by the Program on the Global Environment, the college's current home for undergraduates studying urbanism and the environment. The program offers college courses that explore the relationship between humans, the built environment, and the natural world in cities and ecosystems around the globe, inspiring the next generation of interdisciplinary environmental thinkers. In addition, today's Frizzell event is sponsored by the Pozen Family Center for Human Rights, which promotes rigorous study of the theory and practice of human rights at every level of higher education, supporting a minor forthcoming human, such a prominent scholar of urbanism and geography, because for the first time, this year's Frizzell series is co-sponsored by the Committee on Environment, Geography, and Urbanism, or SEGU, a proposal and development for an interdisciplinary platform on the environment here at UChicago. From the forthcoming human rights major to the possibilities posed by the SEGU proposal, it's a genuinely thrilling time to be a student researcher, faculty member, or anyone else at UChicago passionate about human rights, geography, and the environment. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Kathleen Cavanaugh, who will be introducing Professor Roy and moderating the Q&A portion of tonight's event. Professor Cavanaugh is an interdisciplinary legal scholar whose research investigates law in its social context. She has published on international human rights and humanitarian law, conflict, political violence, the politics of memory, minority rights, militant democracy, and more. Her current research project, Militant Democracy and the Preventative State, examines how the permanence of emergency is beginning to give the concept of securitization of rights legal legs. Both of these scholars have remarkably diverse disciplinary backgrounds, with training in various social science fields, and their conversation will similarly unfold at the intersection of urban science, sociology, and environmental theory. Right now, policing, state power, and democracy are making front-page headlines, splashing across our social media feeds. These two scholars have devoted decades to investigating these topics, and tonight is a wonderful opportunity to hear them explored by true experts. With that, I'd like to welcome to the stage/screen Professor Kathleen Cavanaugh.
Thanks very much, Ruby. So I'm going to keep my comments very brief, so Ananya will have a chance to have the full 40 minutes. But together with Sabina Sheikh, who's the director of the Program on Global Environment, I want to welcome you to this evening's event. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I just want to go over a few household details, a few housekeeping details. I'm going to introduce Ananya. Ananya will speak, and then we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. If I can ask the audience, though, as they think of questions, if they can pop them into the question and answers slot, and we'll be collecting those as we go along. And with that, let me begin. Professor Ananya Roy is professor of urban planning, social welfare, and geography, and the Meyer and Renee Luskin Chair in Equality and Democracy at the University of California at Los Angeles. She is the inaugural director of the Institute on Inequality and Democracy at UCLA, which promotes research and scholarship concerned with displacement and dispossession in LA, and seeks to build power to make social change. Professor Roy's research and scholarship is truly pathbreaking. In her interrogation of the politics and ethics of urban and planning theory, she challenges the dominant disciplinary narratives by, as she writes, stretching the familiar boundaries that foreclose planning theory. Using a feminist and postcolonial lens, her work complicates the relationship between poverty and planning, and importantly, disrupts the foundation upon which planning theory has been constructed, imagined, and defended. Her work deliberately upends the distinction between the empirical and the theoretical, the theory and ethnography dualism through which urban studies is structured. She argues all theory is provincial and parochial and thus empirical. In turn, all empiricism contains within it organizing concept and purposeful norms. Engaging in Ananya Roy's work takes you on a very rich and challenging intellectual journey, one that began with her seminal publication in 2002, City Requiem, where she uses feminist theory to explore the everyday practices of power by women in Calcutta to centralize the gendered dynamics of everyday life as a planning question. In the 20 years since she's published City Requiem, she continues to produce seminal work that both develops and challenges how we understand theory, politics, space, and ethics. It's with great pleasure I introduce Professor Ananya Roy.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, for that introduction, and a big thank you to you and Sabina for the invitation, as well as to Ruby for introducing the lecture series. I'm going to share screen so that we can all look at some visual narratives together. And unfortunately, that means that I won't necessarily get to look at a lot of faces, but I will imagine that we are in a shared space together, and I look forward to the discussion and Q&A. My talk today builds out a line of inquiry concerned with what I am calling post-colonial Los Angeles or the post-colonial US of A. And I'm interested here in the relationship between property and personhood as foundational to colonial power and its afterlives. I will argue today that police, specifically what Nikhil Pal Singh has called the whiteness of police, is central to this relationship between property and personhood. As you will notice, also running through this work is a concept that I've been developing for a few years now. First on the south side of Chicago, as I learned from the Chicago anti-eviction campaign, and now in Los Angeles. And that concept is racial banishment. Needless to say, I want us to think about post-colonial and post-colonial lives not as an after-colonialism, but in fact as a present history shaped by the long histories of settler colonialism, slavery, and imperialism. I also want us to think about the post-colonial in relation to what Derek Gregory, following Edward Said, has reminded us of, that liberal democracy is a story the West likes to tell itself about itself. And of course, this is playing out with agonizing drama on the world stage at the moment. So in particular today, I want us to think about the reproduction of racialized inequality and the reproduction of racialized subordination as an integral part of liberal democracy. And in particular, one that becomes visible if we take a post-colonial lens on liberal democracy. I also want us to keep thinking about ongoing uprising against the death-making apparatus of police and prison, and the ways in which that uprising has insisted that we pay attention to the relationship between the theft of land and the theft of life. So let me start with an example related to that. So later this month, March 13th, will mark the 2-year anniversary of Breonna Taylor's killing by Louisville Metro Police. We now know that the storming of her home with a battering ram, the unrestrained volley of gunfire, the willful abandonment of Ms. Taylor as she, herself an emergency room technician, lay dying without medical attention was part of a massive police operation called place-based investigations. As indicated in the court documents filed by her lawyers, the no-knock search warrant issued for her home was linked to a property 10 miles away, 2424 Elliott Avenue, home of her alleged former boyfriend. Sitting at the center of a neighborhood criminalized by the city, this property was described by Ms. Taylor's lawyers as, I quote, one of the primary roadblocks to a multi-million-dollar development project, something called the Vision Russell Development Plan, which in the words of the reporters who first broke the story, is a plan that anchors a major gentrification makeover of this neighborhood. Ms. Taylor's lawyers thus assert, and I quote, when the layers are peeled back, the origin of Breonna's home being raided by the police starts with the political need to clear out a street for a large real estate development project and finishes with a newly formed rogue police unit violating all levels of policy, protocol, and policing standards. In a meticulous analysis, our comrades, Jessica Bellamy and Joshua Poe, at the Root Cause Research Center in Louisville, lay out how swiftly this clearing out proceeded in the wake of Ms. Taylor's killing. The killing happened on March 13th. By March 17th, Louisville Metro government had declared 2424 Elliott Avenue to be a public nuisance. And by March 21st, tenants of the property had received a notice to vacate from the owner. The police continued surveillance and arrest of the property, and by June 19th, the city had succeeded in acquiring the property. The Louisville Courier-Journal reports, I quote, the property's deed was signed on June 5th, which would have been Breonna Taylor's 27th birthday. It shows that Louisville and Jefferson County Land Bank Authority bought the home for $1. As demonstrated by the Root Cause Research Center, the Land Bank Authority that bought this property for $1 serves to transfer such properties to developers, thereby facilitating the transformation of neighborhoods such as Elliott Avenue. In short, Breonna Taylor's killing by police was collateral for the transmutation of property. This particular articulation of property, personhood, and police is uncannily familiar to us here in Los Angeles, where public nuisance law criminalizes racial others as a threat to property and serves sentences of preemptive racial banishment. In our ongoing research on the making of race and property at the Institute on Inequality and Democracy, along with Tara Graziani, Pamela Stevens, and Joel Montano, I have been trying to uncover the ways in which the legal reason of propertied order pivots on the designation of racialized personhood as nuisance, thereby legitimizing and necessitating territorialized policing, better understood as frontier policing. Let me explain this term, frontier policing. In the now classic text on gentrification, The New Urban Frontier, Neil Smith appropriately uses the term frontier to talk about gentrification. And in doing so, he's invoking, of course, Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis on the frontier as the quote unquote meeting point between savagery and civilization. I'm especially interested in a phrase in Turner's thesis where the frontier is described as the hither edge of free land. That is Elliott Avenue in Louisville. That is South Central Los Angeles. The making of free land rests on the dispossession that Breonna Taylor's killing has once again exposed. I see such dispossession as the dispossession of property as well as the dispossession of personhood. And I argue that such dispossession can be understood as racial banishment, which, following Orlando Patterson, can be understood as a form of social death. It is also often a form of actual death, as we see in Breonna Taylor's case. Now, I first started using the term in relation to the work of the Chicago anti-eviction campaign that very strongly made the argument that it's not enough for us to think about these processes through the familiar vocabulary of gentrification, not even displacement. In fact, they argued that what was going on in Chicago was ethnic cleansing. And then when I moved to Los Angeles and started doing research here, I found that movements in LA were insisting on a similar vocabulary, a vocabulary that framed gentrification as genocide and that framed racial banishment as a key process. So one of my movement teachers, Pete White, who is the founder of the Los Angeles Community Action Network, says the following: displacement is when you have somewhere else to go. Banishment is when there is nowhere else to go. And then Pete will usually add, except jail or death. And so that's the concept that I want to build out today. I start by relying on the work of legal scholars like Catherine Beckett and Steve Herbert, who talk about banishment as legally imposed spatial exclusion. And they argue that in US cities, new urban control tools, such as gang injunctions, city ordinances, aim to, I quote, banish their targets from contested urban spaces for extended periods of time. They also note that these tools rest on a blend of civil and criminal law, and they note that these are practices that are experienced as punishment, even imprisonment, and they usually prefigure and enable traditional punishment, such as criminal justice sanction. In doing so, Beckett and Herbert highlight what they call the central role of the state's coercive power in the exercise of this form of spatial segregation. In my work, I extend this idea in two ways. First, by noting that the state's coercive power is expressed not only in the legal tools that Beckett and Herbert focus on, but also in the sheer police power that is deployed to enact banishment. In other words, banishment is more than legal exclusion, it is state-organized violence. And in just a bit, I'll talk about the lawlessness of racial banishment. In fact, the lawlessness of the law itself. Second, I want to emphasize that what is at work here is not only the banishment of targeted people from urban space, but also the negation of their personhood, the dispossession of their personhood. So following Lisa Marie Cacho, I like to think about social death as a racialized rightlessness. And in particular, the ways in which, as she notes, that social death means that the law extends to such subjects as a form of penal punishment, but these subjects are denied the protection of the law. I also want to argue that banishment is in US cities is necessarily racial banishment. It is a racialized dispossession that takes place in what Saidiya Hartman has called the afterlife of slavery, and through the governance logics of the settler democracy. So today, in the rest of my talk, I want to focus on two regimes of racial banishment in LA that I think will be familiar to all of you in Chicago, because I think that in many ways, Los Angeles is simply an exemplar of these processes, an exemplar of liberal urbanism and these regimes of racial banishment. The first of these, which I will talk about in the second bit of the talk, has to do with the dispossession of personhood experienced by the unhoused and the forms of racial banishment to which they are subjected. And the second of these, which I'll talk about first, following on the Breonna Taylor case, is a distinctive program that we've now been studying for a couple of years, something called the Citywide Nuisance Abatement Program, or CNAP for short, which is one of many public nuisance abatement programs that have proliferated across US cities and is similar to the sort of place-based investigations program that was an integral part of Breonna Taylor's killing in Louisville. So, in 2010, the Los Angeles City Attorney filed nuisance lawsuits against 7 properties clustered in a neighborhood of single-family homes known as Franklin Square, which is in South Central Los Angeles. The lawsuits were aimed at the turf of the Grape Street and Franklin Square Crips gangs, with the filings expressing concern about the geographic insulation and the dead-end layout of this accident of urban design that, in the words of the lawsuit filing, had created an ideal heaven for gang members. In language repeated across all 7 lawsuits, the complaint reads, I quote, part and parcel with this brazen drug dealing, large groups of gang members congregate on the properties and on the sidewalks and streets that connect the properties. There, day and night, they gamble, party, and otherwise openly and notoriously occupy their turf so as to project their control over the small neighborhood in a manner that restricts law-abiding residents' quiet enjoyment of their property and personal lives. Accompanying the lawsuit was what I would call a banishment poster. We have blurred the faces and redacted the names. This is the sort of poster that the LA Police Department hands out door to door in neighborhoods and also shares via PowerPoint and other means of dissemination. It typically contains the names and faces of those who have been ordered by this public nuisance injunction to stay out of the Franklin Square neighborhood, rendering it, as you see on the poster, illegal for them to be in Franklin Square at any time for any reason. These lawsuits and banishment posters provide a glimpse of the CNAP program that we've been studying and mapping for a few years now. As you can see from the map, our research shows that the vast majority of CNAP cases have been filed in the Black and Latinx neighborhoods of Los Angeles. The lawsuits filed by the city attorney's office mostly target housing, be it single-family dwellings or multifamily rental buildings, as well as residential hotels and motels. They are accompanied by long banishment lists and orders. That's an integral part of CNAP injunctions, typically providing, as you see here, incident dates, along with names and the birth dates of the banished. The lawsuits do not provide and do not need to provide legal justification for the banishment. They do not need to explain the incident dates, often creating the presumption that these incident dates are arrest dates or conviction dates, when often they're none of the above. In other words, CNAP conjures criminality but evades the proof of crime. Targets of banishment are determined by police discretion, notably, I quote, the gang expertise and embedded knowledge of senior lead officers and neighborhood prosecutors. In various interviews with former and current city attorneys, we were told that such officers and prosecutors know the community, and therefore they know who should be banished. This is the crux of what has come to be called community policing. We situate such forms of banishment in the long history of race-making, specifically what Simone Brown has termed the surveillance of Blackness. This specific illumination of racialized bodies through such lists and orders serves as the reminder, as Brown notes, that the historical formation of surveillance is not outside of the historical formation of slavery. As lantern laws once marked bodies, Black, mixed race, and Indigenous people as security risks, so do today's nuisance abatement and gang injunctions. And in the ongoing reproduction of American empire, such inscriptions of criminality are grafted onto multiple yet differentiated racial others. So Mary Romero thus reminds us that Latino criminality is produced through the policing of two stereotyped figures, the gang member and the illegal alien. Both seem to be present-day reincarnations of El Bandido, the outlaw character who challenges the propertied order of conquest and must therefore be met by state violence. Perhaps the best way to understand these banishment orders is through the concept of speculative policing, which is closely linked to frontier policing. Speculative policing is a term we borrow from yet another movement teacher here in LA, the amazing Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, an abolitionist organization which has shown the relationship between such forms of policing, capitalist crisis, and real estate development. Their work analyzes what they call the vast architecture of surveillance and show the ways in which policing is based on mass suspicion and the wholesale criminalization of communities and places. In our work, we pinpoint such processes as body property logics, by which we mean the ways in which nuisance law and speculative policing slip between property and personhood. Undergirded by surveillance, there are two important aspects to such body property logics. The first is subjection to what I would call the lawlessness of the law. So from gang injunctions to nuisance abatement, racialized personhood is placed outside of the usual category of criminal and subject to civil procedure without the protections, including burden of proof, offered in criminal cases. Now, legal scholars question the constitutionality of gang injunctions and argue that this kind of civil banishment of gang members is unconstitutional because it actually administers a criminal penalty through a civil hearing. We're concerned not so much with the seeming mismatch of legal instruments, but rather with dehumanization. So I want to emphasize the lawlessness of the law. And in particular here, we follow legal geographer Nick Blomley, who argues against the tendency in liberalism to locate violence outside the law, and instead shows how violence is important to the legitimation, foundation, and operation of a Western property regime. And this is, of course, precisely what critical race theory and Indigenous studies scholars have repeatedly shown, that the law, that legal instruments were created to facilitate land theft and land seizure. Precisely what Nichols has pithily called theft is property. And it is this notion of setting people outside of the category of human that is especially important. So in her crucial intervention following the 1992 Los Angeles uprising, in that famous open letter to colleagues, Sylvia Wynter revealed that the LAPD regularly used the term "no humans involved" to refer to young Black males who were described in these police reports as belonging to, I quote, the jobless category of the inner city ghetto. Wynter asks, how did they come to conceive of what it means to be both human and North American in the kinds of terms, i.e. to be white, of Euro-American culture and descent, middle class, college-educated, suburban, and within whose logic was the jobless category of young Black males perceived and thus seen as the conceptual other to being human, to being North American. Second, such logics of dehumanization entail enactment of removal, spatial removal, Most evident, of course, in gang injunctions. So if we think about the pioneering gang injunction issued by the Los Angeles Superior Court in 1987, it was against the Playboy gangster Crips. And that injunction declared the entire 300-member gang to be a public nuisance and banished it from a 26-block neighborhood in the city. In his famous dissent to this injunction, as well as to the landmark California Supreme Court case with Gallo versus Acuna, which was to really cement gang injunctions in Los Angeles and upheld the constitutionality of these gang injunctions, Justice Mosk very famously argued that such use of public nuisance law criminalized, in Mosk's words, ordinary social behavior, such as walking, driving, gathering in public view. And of course, we know that this injunction and others were meticulously designed to control the movement of specific racialized bodies, particularly of Black and Latinx youth. So it's in this way that nuisance law, in its lawlessness, is both a space-making project and a race-making project. Now, I've been focusing on the relationship between property and personhood as mediated by racialized policing. But one of the findings that surprised us, it's not what we were expecting to see in all of these court records and legal documents. What's been fascinating about studying public nuisance law is that it also establishes a very intimate relationship between police and private property. So in US cities, narcotics and nuisance abatement serve as the pretext for a vast expansion of police presence and surveillance at properties. So in our CNAP court records, what we found was that this included many of the following. The warrantless inspection of guest and tenant records by police upon request and without warrant. The installation of multi-camera video monitoring systems with 24-hour direct feed to police departments, again, without warrant. To key fobs, codes, and clickers that allow police officers to enter all access points for a particular property at all times, again, without any warrant. Under the threat of large fines and even the closure and loss of property, these injunctions thus establish the intimate police surveillance of and non-stop warrantless access to the property and its tenants. In short, private property is transformed into police outposts, decisively expanding the spatiality of police power in cities. And all of this gives the state actually considerable power over the regulation and governance of private property. So in addition to this extraterritorial policing, CNAP abatements also allow the city attorney's office and the LAPD to determine who can buy such property and on what terms. Again, relying on the amazing Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, we see this as the consolidation of the stalker state, a sprawling apparatus of surveillance systems, predictive policing algorithms, and spatialized imaginations of crime and terror. Where does this transformation of private property into police outposts take place? We also argue that they take place in neighborhoods that are on the front lines of gentrification. Remember my earlier point about frontier policing. And these are the neighborhoods that Maggie Ramirez, in her work on gang injunctions, has called borderland neighborhoods. And what is particularly underway in borderland neighborhoods is the long-standing project of community policing. Following the work of historians of the police state, such as Elizabeth Hinton, we thus interpret community policing and programs like CNAP and so forth as counter-insurgent formations. those that took shape during the Great Society, yoking the war on poverty to the war on crime, and indeed to wars overseas. LA was testing ground for and pioneer of many of these community policing programs, especially as historian Stuart Schrader has shown in the aftermath of the Watts Rebellion, when there was a massive infusion of federal resources for policing. The dominant imagination was that of war, with LA politicians and police chiefs describing the fight against gangs by using the term, "This is Vietnam here." But of course, of LAPD's aggressive militaristic forms of policing, Schrader pithily states, "It was not a lesson learned in Vietnam, it was native to Los Angeles." The reanimation of community policing at the current moment is crucial. And I've put up on the screen an example of what the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition calls academic complicity in policing. A report authored by my faculty colleagues at UCLA, including 2 in my department of social welfare, and the notorious professor of anthropology, Brantingham, who is the author of many of the most racist algorithms of predictive policing. And this was a report issued in March 2020, and that has been widely used by the LAPD to legitimize the expansion of community policing in Los Angeles, especially in the wake of uprising. All right. In thinking about community policing, I also want to return to the earlier argument I was making about how, in this lawlessness of the law that is public nuisance, as we think about property, personhood, and police, there is a slippage between property and personhood. And so for just a minute, I want you all to think about the fact that a great deal of brilliant scholarship on public nuisance has been done by scholars who are thinking from the global south. And I've put only 2 books up on the screen, but there are many others. These are both books that pay attention to legal reason and legal authority around public nuisance in Delhi and the role of public nuisance in mass evictions. In Rule by Aesthetics, for example, Asher Gertner shows how in the early 2000s in Delhi, there was a large increase in public interest litigations filed by resident welfare associations. So these are property owner associations that mobilized around quality of life and neighborhood security issues. And such litigation pushed the courts to rule on what is and is not a public nuisance. Those rulings revived the use of nuisance that had been prevalent during British colonialism in India and created a new or renewed legal regime that targeted slums that were designated as public nuisance. Gertner shows that this politics of visibility, the targeting of slums that looked dirty, that looked unkempt, was quickly folded into a politics of personhood. As he writes, I quote, "Individuals or groups themselves became nuisance categories." So city residents who did not own property, who were seen to be outside of the ownership of property, became a secondary category of citizens. They became nuisance. Similarly, in the public's interest, Gautam Pan argues that this new urban legal regime in Delhi made illegality not a particular act or not even a use of land, but personhood itself. That the courts shifted their language from encroachment to encroacher. So as Pan notes, the encroacher became the antithesis of citizen, became someone unworthy of rights. The effects of this legal regime have been stunning in India. They've been mass evictions. So the opening photographs of Gautam Pan's book are of a settlement called Pushta in Delhi, which was a settlement that existed for nearly 17 years, about 150,000 people, when in 2004, in the blink of an eye, Pushta was declared to be a nuisance and completely erased. So it is this sort of erasure that I want to draw attention to. Pan emphasizes that contemporary mass evictions in India, like Pushta, have happened through democratic processes. And in the case of LA, I would say our research shows that it's not just mass evictions that have happened through democratic processes, but it's mass death that is happening through democratic processes. One of our most recent research reports that we published in December shows that between March 2020 and July 2021, so more or less in the span of a year, 1,500 unhoused residents of LA died on the streets of LA, and another 400 died in shelter settings. It's that kind of mass death that is taking place through processes of spatial illegalization, right? And I'm going to talk more about spatial illegalization in just a minute as I turn to the case of homelessness in Los Angeles and again to racial banishment. But I want to emphasize that what we also learned from the work on the Global South is that spatial illegalization targets very specific personhood categories remade as nuisance categories. So in his book on Delhi, Asher Gertner shows how in that same riverbed that the Pushta settlement was in, and the Pushta settlement, that mass eviction was justified as something that was needed to protect the river and protect the riverbed, that this was an environmentally sensitive area, that the settlement was damaging the ecosystem. In that same riverbed, there have been spectacularly large developments, including one of India's largest Hindu temples, the Akshardham Temple, all of which, by urban planning standards, are illegal. And yet these forms of elite illegality have not only been valorized by the state, they have in fact been enabled by the state. They've been enabled by the urban planning apparatus, while the so-called encroachments of the poor have been subject to spatial illegalization. All right, so with that in mind, let's turn to the case of my second example of racial banishment and property, personhood, and police. We all know that the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed and deepened inequality in our cities. And this is starkly evident in the sphere of housing. So in Los Angeles, during the pandemic, the country's most expensive home went on the market. You see it here on the hill. It's about a mile from the UCLA campus. It's a property called The One. It went on the market for an asking price of $350 million, a sharply discounted price from the original $500 million asked for by the developer. In that same time period, as I've already mentioned, our research shows that nearly 1,500 unhoused residents died on the streets of Los Angeles, another 400 in hotel rooms where they were part of an emergency shelter program called Project Rorty. And indeed, a new regime of banishment is taking hold in Los Angeles with the waning of COVID compassion. In March 2021, residents of a homeless encampment in Echo Park Lake, a public park in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, were evicted by the city of Los Angeles through a spectacular show of police force that sparked local, national, and international outrage. Scores of protesters were arrested in trying to prevent the eviction, and police and park rangers enclosed the park through a chain link fence that remains to this day. In the weeks following the displacement, I convened a research project titled After Echo Park Lake that brings together university and movement-based scholars with unhoused comrades, some of them displaced from Echo Park Lake, to study the aftermath of displacement. For the past year now, we have closely followed displaced residents, And on March 23rd, we will release our massive monograph. We've written a damn book. The monograph is 80,000 words on our research findings around displacement. And I can talk more about this in Q&A if you'd like. But the Echo Park Lake displacement was just one piece of the making of what has now become clear is a violent regime of racial banishment. In September 2021, so this is the report that will appear on March 23rd, in September of last year, the Los Angeles City Council expanded what was already a cruel anti-camping law, LAMC 4118, which is a prohibition on sitting, sleeping, lying, and storing personal property in much of the city, in zones that you see marked as red, but the zones keep expanding because City Council has the authority to pass resolutions adding zones to this already quite frightful map. The ordinance marks the absolute banishment of homeless persons from urban space. It's framed as a defense of the public right of way, especially for quote unquote sensitive facilities such as schools, daycare facilities, parks, and libraries. It enables individual city council members to enact the criminalization and removal of specific encampments and all persons living in them. In many ways, it expands the logic of what has already been going on in so many of our cities, what are known as encampment sweeps, which take place as sanitation cleanups, but are really cleanups at gunpoint with police enforcement and intimidation. Indeed, the city of Los Angeles deploys vast public resources, millions and millions of dollars each year, in these sweeps to systematically confiscate and destroy the personal property of the unhoused. So in Los Angeles, the ordinance behind the sweeps is LAMC 5611, which limits the ownership of personal property by an unhoused person to a single 60-gallon trash bag. The dimensions of the trash bags used by the city's sanitation department, which conducts the sweeps. And it authorizes a whole range of city workers to seize and destroy so-called excess property, anything more than the 60-gallon trash bag. In other words, the unhoused have no right to personal property. In a similar lawlessness of the law, LAMC 8502 has illegalized living and sleeping in one's car. And what is in effect is what a Ninth Circuit Court ruling against 8502, an earlier version of 8502, described as the criminalization of innocent behavior. In striking down an earlier version of this ordinance, the courts said that this is a criminalization of innocent behavior. Why is it illegal to sleep in one's car? Why is it illegal to have a meal in one's car? And yet these are ordinances that very specifically target the unhoused as a secondary category of citizens. In a well-known essay on homelessness, Jane Barron defined homelessness as a property problem, arguing that homelessness is a problem not of poverty, but of property. The homeless, she emphasized, belong to the legal category of no property. So under conditions of what I have called propertied citizenship, the unhoused are not only subject to racialized rightlessness, they actually now have no right to exist at all in urban space. The legal category of no property then is not just a biopolitical category concerned with the management of life, it is a necropolitical category because it is about the politics of death. So the life expectancy of an unhoused woman in Los Angeles today is 48 years. The average life expectancy of an unhoused man in Los Angeles today is 51 years. Planning theorist Libby Porter thus asks a vitally important question on this matter of liberal democracy and rights She asks for what is to become of those who cannot prove their worth across the thresholds of recognition. And she argues that in liberal/settler democracies, that threshold of recognition is set by what I call propertied citizenship. It is a possessory logic that dominates all claims of recognition. So she asks what then happens to the social subjects who are excluded from possessory recognizability. And what happens, of course, is that that relationship, that setting outside that I'm calling racial banishment, is managed through frontier and speculative policing. And especially useful here is how Nikhilpal Singh has thought of what he calls the whiteness of police. I quote, as a whiteness here, as something that manages an unequal property order. So Singh writes, whiteness does not issue directly from private property. It emerges from the governance of property and its interests in relationship to those who have no property and who are therefore imagined to harbor a potentially criminal disregard for propertied order. He argues that the whiteness of police is a crucial method for, I quote, regulating an unequal ordering of property relationships. Now, I also want to note, and this is a great deal of the work that we do in the After Echo Park Lake Research Collective and in the broader work of the Institute, the property is also the insurgent ground of our cities, a site of rebellion against global racial capitalism and its protocols of racial banishment. I'm borrowing the phrase insurgent ground from the absolutely stunning book by Saidiya Hartman, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, which I think is one of the most important texts to understand urban life. Hartman foregrounds the insurgent ground of the lives of young Black women who, I quote, struggled to create autonomous and beautiful lives through open rebellion. And so she allows us to think about rebellion and uprising as a long arc, rather than as a singular moment of crisis and protest. And all around me, I see, therefore, in Los Angeles, not only these regimes of racial banishment, but this insurgent ground, this open rebellion. I see it in El Sereno in East Los Angeles, where movements like Reclaiming Our Homes, similar to Moms for Housing in Oakland, where those unhoused by global racial capitalism have insisted on occupying vacant speculative and vacant public property. So on a housing justice signal thread, Benito Flores, who's one of the reclaimers, recently reminded me, Benito wrote, the reasoning of those in power is that we are guilty of being homeless. We refuse to be made guilty. We are lawfully homeless because we have been made homeless by high rents, low wages, and cruel laws. Benito's refusal of the frame of illegal occupation is crucial because it is a refusal of the terms of property that have been established in settler democracies. And it shows the ways in which property can, in fact, be the grounds of insurgency. Another example from a tenant struggle in Los Angeles's Chinatown. So if eminent domain has been widely used as a tool of urban development, benefiting the propertied classes, then what does it mean to use this master's tools for the purposes of housing justice? Tenants in hillside villas in LA's Chinatown is a very interesting example because many of the long-standing tenants here were themselves displaced by eminent domain during the construction many decades ago of the LA Convention Center. And now they're facing displacement again, and they are now fighting for the use of eminent domain for public acquisition of their building, whose affordable housing covenant has expired. Another key site of such insurgency is rent, specifically the widespread call by tenant unions for rent cancellation. As I'm sure you all know, working class communities of color across the US are on the brink of what we have been calling an eviction tsunami. We were one of the first research centers in the country to sound the alarm on impending evictions. And we now know that working class communities of color, tenants in those communities are carrying a massive burden of rent debt that has been accumulated during the pandemic. But inspired by tenant movements and also inspired by Denise Ferreira da Silva's work on unpayable debt, we think about rental debt as debt that exceeds the legitimacy of both the law, contract, and morality obligation. So the LA Tenants Union, which is now the largest tenants union in the country, reminds us that rent is theft. And this requires all of us then to think critically about our relationship to property. Our research collective, in the work we do, stands in solidarity with a newly formed homeless union in Los Angeles, which was formed by many of the people displaced from the Echo Park Lake encampment. It's an organization, a union called ATTACK, Unhoused Tenants Against Carceral Housing. And you see here one of my comrades from the research collective, Will Sens, who was displaced from Echo Park Lake, holding up the banner. And you see in the foreground, Theo Henderson, who is currently activist in residence at the Institute, who is an unhoused organizer and founder of the We the Unhoused podcast. That naming, unhoused tenants, is meant to provoke a critical relationality to property for all of us, to dismantle the forms of property citizenship through which we have all come to dwell in global racial capitalism. And so I'll end with a reminder from the Los Angeles Community Action Network, one of my movement teachers. I've talked about their work many times in today's talk. So Pete White, in analyzing banishment, will often remind me that the antonym of banishment is not integration, it's not inclusion, it is not equity, it is freedom. And that is precisely what is at stake in the ways in which movements in LA and across US cities are organizing in order to make property itself an insurgent ground and to abolish all of the forms of policing through which racial capitalism has come to be governed. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much, Ananya. That was brilliant, and it covered so much very rich ground. So I'm going to take the first question, if I can, and ask if you wouldn't mind. I know you said that this was about to be published, but you said you have been looking at, so my question all the way through is, you have these nuisance orders that people are not allowed to go into their neighborhoods and they're banished, but obviously they have to go somewhere. And the Echo Park Lake project seems that you're actually mapping that out. So if you wouldn't mind just saying a little bit about where they're going, do they not face the same obstacles wherever they move around the city?
Kathleen, thank you so much for that question. That has been the question that has kept me awake on many sleepless nights and has motivated this research. So precisely if displacement is when you have somewhere to go and banishment is nowhere to go except jail or death, we catch glimpses of this in the research and organizing that has been done in LA. So there's a real sense of people being pushed out. Right, so Pamela Stevens, who's a co-researcher on the Public Nuisance Project, her work is on the changing geographies of Black Los Angeles. And her maps show the incredible loss in Black communities, the actual loss of Black population in Los Angeles, and the ways in which communities have been scattered, disappeared. So when people say, I was pushed out to the desert, they don't simply mean that metaphorically. They actually mean being pushed out to the far edges of urban life. And this is a process that we're seeing in many US cities. where in fact urban studies scholars are talking about a new kind of peripheralization. That if earlier we thought about racial segregation as a containment, i.e. in ghettoization, that the new forms of racial violence might involve this kind of peripheralization, right? This pushing out, this disappearing. This is precisely the reason why we wanted to carefully follow displaced Echo Park Lake residents. And I will say that so many of the people displaced have been scattered, they've lost touch with other members of that community. We've lost touch with them despite our best research and community efforts. But one of the things we are finding is that these displacements are being justified through claims of housing placements. The people are being told they will be housed, they're being placed in shelter and temporary programs, partly because there's a lot of federal money, and in the case of California, a lot of state money for these kinds of temporary programs, a lot of it related to COVID economic relief and emergency money. Our argument is that these forms of shelter, these placements are actually carceral. So we've been talking about a continuum of carcerality, right? That these kinds of placements mimic and extend the prison industrial complex. And so even if people are still in the heart of the city, they are still dislocated and separated. So I'll give you an example. Many of the Echo Park Lake residents who accepted these placements were placed in one Project Roomkey site at the LA Grand Hotel, which is now the largest PRK site. So Project Roomkey is a temporary program funded by FEMA, and it allows localities to use FEMA money to lease hotels and motels to temporarily house the unhoused during the pandemic. So they're literally contained and held in this massive hotel under carceral rules and conditions. They're under curfew. It's called Project Roomkey, but they're not allowed room keys. In fact, the security guards, 2 on every that let people in and out of their rooms. They're in complete carceral isolation. They're not allowed to interact with each other, ever. They're not allowed to get mail. They're not allowed to get phone calls. And this has led to some of the deaths, the many deaths that we have now documented. So this is yet another example of banishment where people are supposedly right there. They're there in downtown LA, but they are in a state of social death. They're in a state of racialized rightlessness and carceral isolation.
So, Ananya, can I do one just quick follow-up question? You've spoken about going through court records and also, I think, have built a really beautiful idea of the legal architecture, which you, I think, have referred to the lawlessness of the law. Is it also true, and we see this in a lot of states of emergency situations where you might actually not have a law that allows the police to do what they're doing, but they do it anyway, or you have an injunction on a particular issue, but the police ignore it. Do you see a lot of that in the work that you're looking at?
Yes, I think, again, and that is an issue that I think we struggled with analytically, right? Because our first impulse was to think about this in terms of frontier policing and speculative policing, which we've done, right? Forms of policing that are continuous with the many forms of racialized policing that we know well. And so it is very much then about policing as something that ignores the law, exceeds the law. But the reason why I kept emphasizing the lawlessness of the law is I think I've been really struck by the ways in which these injunctions and then the following settlements, right, cement this kind of policing. They almost require this kind of policing. And that the lawlessness of the law validates and legalizes the lawlessness, right? And that's why I talked about the example of the Hindu temple on the same riverbed of Pushta, right? So Pushta was destroyed, 150,000 people displaced overnight. And yet that temple, even though it's completely illegal by every planning law and rule was actually folded into the master plan of Delhi and legalized. Right? So this is partly what I mean by the lawlessness of the law, which is related to the kinds of policing, but does something else, right? That allows the law to legalize and sanction this kind of violence.
Okay, I'm going to now take some of the questions. So the first one was, you spoke of the banishment connection in India. Can you speak to it in the US, in Los Angeles, for example?
Yes, I think that's a very good question. I am not an environmental justice scholar, but this is exactly what environmental justice scholars have shown. And they've shown the ways in which, and I'm thinking here about the work, say, of Laura Pulido on white spatial privilege in Los Angeles, where she shows the ways in which working class communities of color are not only subject to incredible burdens of environmental pollution, but are not protected by the environmental laws that are supposedly on the books, right? But I should also say that when it comes to the homeless encampment sweeps we're now seeing and the anti-camping laws, so much of this is being legitimized in the narrative of environmental outcomes. So the criminalization of the homeless encampment at Echo Park Lake took place through two narratives. One was around crime and really a targeting of Black unhoused residents and Black organizers there. And the other was through, we've got to clean up the park and we've got to green it. And it was a deliberate narrative around middle-class people and their children are unsafe in the park if they're homeless people in the park. But it was also that this is a fragile lake and having an encampment there is threatening the environmental viability of the lake and the park, right? And thus rendering it a nuisance. So that kind of weaponization of environmental goals, standards is, I think, commonplace now in many of our cities.
Thank you. Second question, many nonprofits, community groups, mutual aid networks are working towards starting or expanding land trusts around the country. Some are held publicly, but some groups are trying to put property in community control. Have you seen this succeeding and working as property as insurgency against banishment? If not, what do you think holds it back?
Yes, that's a wonderful question. We spent a lot of time at the Institute thinking about what we call the futures of social housing, that if we are to take seriously the possibility of property as insurgent ground, as the question implies, it's crucial for us to think about how property comes to be decommodified and what this means. So I'll say a couple of things on this. The movements that I highlighted today, particularly the Reclaiming Our Homes movement in El Sereno, is very focused on thinking about these decommodified relationships. So whether that be in the form of a land trust or a housing cooperative, they are very interested in decommodified property and community control of property, right? Many of the movements have also been pushing for the public acquisition of vacant and distressed and speculative property, and really thinking about, once that acquisition happens, how that property can be held in decommodified form and through community control. And there's a very interesting white paper by our colleagues at the Urban Democracy Lab at NYU, which is the idea for a national social housing development authority that could do just that. And we've been thinking a lot about how all of this gets financed, right? So whether you think about a public banking movement, which has started to take hold in LA, or other forms of financing. And finally, I would say that it's really important, I think, for us to think about how difficult this is to do in settler democracies and the ways in which indigenous sovereignty movements provide really crucial guidance, not only by insisting on land back and land rematriation, but by inviting us to think about what it would mean to have healing relationships to land. And I'm thinking here about the work of the Land Relationships Super Collective, which brings together Black and Indigenous organizers around this question of a different relationship to land.
Thank you, Ananya. The second question that I have, or third question, now that some gang injunctions are no longer being enforced or used in Southern California, do you think that racial banishment of gang members will continue in other forms?
Yes, that's a great question. So guess what the city attorney's office calls in their own PowerPoint slides called CNAP, which is a program we studied, gang injunctions by another name. So in many ways, explicitly, right, the city attorneys have argued that now that they are being held accountable for gang injunctions, especially for the databases, right, they get to do something like CNAP. And I will say CNAP's worse than gang databases and gang injunctions, because they don't even have to show that the people on these banishment lists are in any gang database, right? It's just literally police officers saying, yeah, we know that these folks are gang members. They have to be banished. One of the programs associated with CNAP that I didn't talk about is a program called Vacate, which is an eviction program. It's a preemptive eviction program. So basically what it does is the city attorney's office files a lawsuit against both the landlord and tenants. And it commands the landlord to evict the named tenant within a matter of days. That command is based once again on incidents, and in this case on arrests, but arrests are not convictions. So in the work we've done, we've then followed these arrest records and noted, of course, that many of them never resulted in conviction, and yet people were preemptively evicted, and not just evicted with that kind of eviction on their record forever, i.e. banished from housing markets with no possibility of recourse, right? So unfortunately, there are all of these other mechanisms through which now the work of gang injunctions not only continues, but in fact is being expanded.
Fourth question, how do you see this connecting to what is going on with regards to refugee, religious minorities, and non-citizen ghettos on an international scale? What sort of social effects do you see playing out?
Yes, that's an important question always, and especially now. I noted earlier that in thinking about racial banishment, I draw on the work of Lisa Marie-Karcher on social death, and that work in turn draws on Orlando Patterson's notion of social death. And that's really the idea of banishment is one around civil death, right? Which is what we see in CNAP and other things. But the argument is that the civil death is a social death. And that social death, as I noted, is this rightlessness. You become a secondary category. Not just you become less than human, but you also have an abbreviated set of rights under the law. Whether it be that the unhoused don't have the right to own any personal property, or it be the tenants don't have any right to due process in an eviction. And we can argue, therefore, that, that there are many other categories of personhood that are subject to this kind of rightlessness. And clearly, internally displaced persons, global refugees, those targeted as racial minorities. You think about Texas and the fight over trans rights. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, unfortunately.
We have time for one more, Ananya, if you will. Can you talk a little bit about the role of the construction and expansion of large educational institutions like universities in this racial banishment?
Thank you for that question. And I'm going to mention two things. The first is the brilliant work of Devarian Baldwin and his book In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower that came out last year. There is a long chapter on Chicago and the University of Chicago, right? So when I talked about speculative policing, frontier policing, extraterritorial policing, right? You all know how the University of Chicago, along with Columbia and others, are exemplars of such forms of policing, right? And Baldwin brilliantly shows the connections between real estate development, powerful universities, and these forms of policing. And the second point I want to make is that, you know, particularly in the context of the uprisings, we have felt it to be as faculty and students at UCLA, we have thought it really important for us to think about what the transformation of our university means. And so I'm one of the founding members of a group called Divest Invest, UCLA faculty. And we formed in 2020 when our main baseball stadium, our UCLA baseball stadium, named after Jackie Robinson, was used by LAPD to detain, arrest, intimidate, harass Black Lives Matter protesters, right? And it turned out that the university administration had given permission to LAPD to turn our baseball stadium into a massive open-air field jail. And the university still has not issued an apology or done any repair for this, but we organized as faculty. And, you know, in the research that we have done, we are able to show how our police department, on which the university spent something like $25 million a year, targets Black students in particular. 85% of the calls it responds to has nothing to do with any threat of force violence. It has to do with policing people who seem to be out of place in relation to what are perceived to be property crimes. And much of this policing is happening far outside the boundaries of the UCLA campus. Okay? Extraterritorial policing of mainly unhoused people or Black students and community members who are seen to be out of place. So when we talk about the urgent need for abolition at our universities, what we have in mind is calling into question and challenging the university as a policed propertied order. And I think the final point I want to make here, going back to the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, is that they remind us that if we are to challenge the university as police propertied order, it's not just challenging the police force of the university or its real estate plans, it's challenging the research that is produced to legitimize racialized policing, be it predictive policing algorithms or the whitewashing of community policing. That is actually very intimate. It means confronting colleagues in our own disciplines and departments and holding ourselves collectively accountable for academic harm and academic complicity in these structures of racial subordination.
Thanks very much, Ananya. Firstly, to the audience, I have to give apologies. There's a lot more questions, but we are going to benefit from Professor Roy talking to some of our students, and we need to give her a break. So I'm going to bring tonight's lecture to conclusion, firstly, by thanking Ananya Roy so very much. It was brilliant, as expected, but it was brilliant. And I think everyone, if you look at the chat, has really enjoyed it. I also want to take the opportunity to thank the Frizzell family for their support in this event, the sponsorship on the Program of Global Environment, the Committee on Environment, Geography, Urbanization, as well as the Pozen Center for Human Rights, and particularly Carlo Diaz and Cliff Chan for organizing this event. Thank you very much, Ananya.
Thank you so much.